Hello. Settle in comfortably, wrap yourself up warmly, and let the gentle whisper of stories carry you into a deep, peaceful sleep. Imagine the biting wind of a January morning in 14th century England. Not merely a chill, but a deep, pervasive cold that penetrated stone and bone alike. Before dawn, in countless humble dwellings and even the draughty halls of nobility, the air inside was often barely warmer than the frozen world outside. This wasn't merely discomfort. It was a daily struggle for survival. Historical climate data indicates that the medieval warm period, while generally milder than periods before and after, still experienced significant cold snaps, particularly during the mini ice age that began around the 13th century and deepened into the 14th and 15th centuries. Records from ecclesiastical chronicles and agricultural accounts frequently mention unusually harsh winters, some with rivers frozen solid for weeks, impacting transport and food supply. For instance, the winter of 1309 to 1310 was noted across Europe for its severity, with widespread reports of livestock loss due to cold and lack of fodder. Expert analyses of tree rings and ice core samples corroborate these historical accounts, painting a picture of significant climatic variability. Dr. Eleanor Burnham, a historical climatologist, notes, "While we lack precise temperature readings from the period, the sheer volume of anecdotal evidence, coupled with dendrochronological data, leaves no doubt that medieval winters could be crushingly cold, often far exceeding what modern Europeans experience today without central heating. Consider the typical medieval English home, whether a wattle and daub cottage or a stone manor. Insulation, as we know it, simply didn't exist. Walls were permeable, roofs often thatched with straw, providing little barrier against temperatures that could plummet to -10 degrees Celsius, 14 degrees Fahrenheit, or lower, especially during prolonged cold snaps. Windows, if present at all, were small, unglazed apertures, often covered with oiled cloth or wooden shutters that sealed poorly. The primary source of heat, a central hearth or brazier, would emit smoke that needed an escape, usually through a hole in the roof, further compromising any attempt at heat retention. The very act of sleeping in such conditions constitutes a stark insight into human resilience in the face of primal cold. This daily battle against the cold-shaped architecture, clothing, social customs, and even the very fabric of medieval life. Understanding this fundamental challenge is key to appreciating the ingenuity and hardship of those times. As the harsh winter winds rattled through the permeable walls of a medieval English dwelling, the battle against the cold shifted from the structural to the intensely personal. With external temperatures often well below freezing and internal air barely warmer, the human body became the primary thermostat, a precarious system constantly striving for homeostasis in the face of debilitating hypothermia. Physiologically, sleeping in extreme cold demands a significant metabolic response. The human body, in a conscious or unconscious state, prioritizes maintaining core temperature, typically around 37 degrees Celsius, 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. In a cold environment, blood vessels near the skin constrict, diverting blood flow to vital organs. This reduces heat loss, but also makes extremities feel achingly cold. Shivering, an involuntary muscular contraction, is the body's attempt to generate heat through rapid movement, burning calories at an accelerated rate. For medieval people, this often meant waking up exhausted, having spent the night shivering and fighting off the cold. Evidence from historical texts and archaeological finds reveals practical countermeasures. Dr. Alistair Jenkins, an expert in medieval domestic life, explains, while there was no central heating, there was an acute understanding of thermal insulation through textiles and shared body warmth. Animal furs, particularly sheepskin, were exceptionally valued for their insulating properties. Wool, a readily available resource in England, was spun into dense, heavy blankets and clothing. A 13th century inventory from Ramsey Abbey lists thicker wolle blankets among bedding provisions for its monks, indicating the necessity of layered insulation. Consider the layout of a medieval bedroom, often a communal space, especially in commoner homes or even within a manor's shared dormitories. Multiple family members or even servants might sleep in the same bed, or on closely packed sleeping platforms on floors strewn with rushes. This practice, often termed huddling, was not just for companionship, but a pragmatic strategy for survival. The combined body heat of several individuals sleeping in close proximity significantly raised the ambient temperature within their immediate sleeping area. Research into the thermodynamics of human clusters by environmental physiologists demonstrates that even two individuals can reduce heat loss considerably more effectively than two individuals sleeping separately in a cold environment. Beyond the shared beds, even the practice of sleeping mostly naked, a custom observed in some segments of medieval society until later periods, might appear counterintuitive. However, it allowed the body to efficiently transfer its warmth into the fabric layers, like the thick wool blankets and straw mattresses, rather than being trapped within an outer layer of clothing, which could become damp from perspiration and then chill the body further. The body's last stand against the frost was a combination of innate physiological responses, cleverly utilized natural materials, and the enduring warmth of human proximity. It highlights a profound understanding of survival, born from necessity, where even sleep became a deliberate act of engineering warmth. While the intense cold demanded ingenious solutions for sleeping, the desire for warmth naturally drew medieval inhabitants towards the hearth, the glowing heart of any home. Yet, this flickering source of comfort carried a perilous, often unseen threat: the twin dangers of smoke inhalation and carbon monoxide poisoning, turning its promise of warmth into a potential false one. For much of the medieval period, particularly in commoner dwellings and even in earlier manorial halls, rudimentary heating involved an open fire pit in the center of the room. There were no integrated chimneys as we understand them today. Smoke would simply rise to the ceiling and then ideally seep out through a smoke hole, a louver, or gaps in the thatch. Imagine the dense, acrid air during a cold, still night when the smoke struggled to vent, clinging to the rafters and filling the breathing space below. Architectural historians, examining surviving medieval structures and archaeological floor plans, consistently find evidence of these central hearths without sophisticated flues for centuries. Dr. Miriam Schofield, an environmental health historian, highlights the pervasive issue. Chronic exposure to wood smoke would have been an inescapable reality. Beyond immediate irritation, the long-term health consequences, including respiratory diseases like chronic bronchitis and asthma, would have been endemic. For those sleeping in these conditions, the risks were significantly amplified. The particulate matter from wood smoke inflames the respiratory tract, making individuals more susceptible to infections, a constant threat in a pre-antibiotic era. Beyond the visible smoke lurked the silent killer, carbon monoxide, CO. The incomplete combustion of wood in a poorly ventilated space produces this odorless, colorless gas. CO binds to hemoglobin in red blood cells far more readily than oxygen, effectively suffocating the body's tissues at a cellular level. Medieval medical treatises, while not explicitly identifying carbon monoxide poisoning, frequently describe mysterious ailments of the night, or vapor sickness, where individuals would fall ill or even perish without obvious cause, particularly during winter, when fires burned constantly and ventilation was minimized to conserve heat. These accounts, when analyzed through a modern lens, strongly suggest CO poisoning. For instance, documents from probate courts sometimes mention accidental deaths, where individuals were found deceased in their beds with no signs of violence, especially during severe cold spells. While not always conclusive, the circumstances are profoundly indicative of the silent peril. The need to maintain even a minimal level of warmth meant keeping fires alight, intensifying the danger. The promise of the hearth, while providing some respite from the biting cold, simultaneously posed a significant and often fatal risk, transforming the simple act of sleeping into a gamble against suffocation and poison. This trade-off between warmth and air quality was an ever-present, daunting reality for medieval households. Even with the inherent dangers of smoke and carbon monoxide, fire remained the primary, indeed almost the sole source of active heating in medieval England. But maintaining that fire, especially through the long, cold nights, presented its own formidable challenges, primarily the relentless demand for firewood. This was not merely a matter of convenience, it was a constant, energy-intensive, and often politically charged daily burden. For peasant households, the acquisition of fuel was an integral part of life. Rights to gather wood, known as turbary or estovers, were often stipulated in manorial charters and village customs. However, these rights were rarely unlimited. Villagers were typically permitted to collect dead wood and fallen branches from communal woodlands or the lord's forests, but felling live timber was usually strictly forbidden and punishable by fines or even more severe penalties. The practice of lopping or pollarding trees for firewood and fodder was common, ensuring a renewable supply, but it required consistent effort and management. Dr. Richard O'Connell, a historian specializing in medieval agriculture and land use, emphasizes the scale of the demand. To keep a fire burning continuously, particularly in an uninsulated dwelling through winter, required a colossal amount of wood. A single household could consume several cubic meters of timber over a winter season. Multiplying that by hundreds, if not thousands of households in a region, it becomes clear that fuel procurement was a major economic and ecological undertaking. The collection process itself was arduous. Gathering, cutting, splitting, and transporting heavy bundles of wood, often over considerable distances, was physically draining labor, typically performed by women and children. For wealthier households, manors and castles, the scale of fuel consumption was even greater. Records from medieval estates meticulously detail the vast quantities of wood ordered for great halls, kitchens, and private chambers. For instance, the household accounts of Framlingham Castle in the 14th century show substantial expenditure on charcoal and firewood, delivered by cartloads. This required organized forestry, often managed by foresters, and the labor of numerous woodcutters and carters. While the wealthy could afford to pay for fuel, the logistics of supply remained complex and costly. Despite these efforts, firewood was a finite resource within accessible limits, and a bad harvest or a particularly harsh winter could lead to fuel shortages, driving up prices and exacerbating hardship. The constant tending of the fire, ensuring a steady supply of well-seasoned wood that would burn effectively without excessive smoke, was a continuous chore that extended well into the night for those who sought to carry its warmth, however limited, into their sleep. The firewood's burden was a heavy one, shaping not just the warmth of their homes, but the very rhythm of daily existence. While the common folk grappled with the vulnerabilities of wattle and daub, a different challenge confronted the medieval elite: the inherent thermal inefficiency of stone. The mighty castles and grand manor houses that symbolize power and security were, for all their impressive stature, often profoundly cold, damp environments, forcing even the wealthiest to adopt strategies for sleeping that prioritized warmth over conventional comfort. Stone, a magnificent building material for defense and durability, is a poor insulator. Its high thermal mass means it retains cold effectively, radiating a penetrating chill into inner chambers long after any daytime warmth has dissipated. Professor Evelyn Reed, an architectural historian specializing in medieval structures, explains, while castles offered unparalleled protection against human adversaries, they were remarkably poor at defending against the cold. The sheer volume of cold stone and the lack of comprehensive heating systems meant that internal temperatures in winter often hovered just above freezing, especially in areas distant from the few fireplaces. Even when fireplaces became more common in the late medieval period, they were often inefficient. Early chimneys were wide and shallow, drawing much of the heated air directly up and out. Furthermore, a single fireplace, no matter how large, struggled to heat a vast hall or a high-ceiling chamber. The great hall, the social and administrative heart of a castle, would be alight with fires during the day, yet the moment activity ceased and the fires dwindled, the cold would quickly reclaim the space. For sleeping, the damp chill was particularly insidious. Moisture, inherent in old stone and exacerbated by poor ventilation, permeated everything. Medieval tapestries, often depicted in historical illustrations as decorative, served a far more pragmatic purpose. Hung on walls, particularly in sleeping chambers, they were a crucial layer of insulation, trapping air between the cold stone and the room's interior. This created a small, albeit imperfect, air gap that mitigated the radiant cold from the walls. Similarly, wooden paneling, where present, offered a slightly greater degree of insulation than bare stone. Immersing oneself in such a space, one quickly grasped the sensory reality of the medieval elite. Imagine retiring to a chamber where the very air feels thick with cold, where your breath plumes visibly, and the stone walls weep a perpetual dampness, even with roaring fires in the great hall during the evening. The journey to a private chamber, then up a winding stone staircase, would quickly divest one of any retained warmth. For those in castles, sleep wasn't merely about personal warmth, but also about creating microclimates of tolerable temperature within these vast, cold fortresses. The damp chill of stone was a constant adversary, one that even power and wealth struggled to overcome, emphasizing that comfort, as we understand it, was a luxury largely unknown in medieval sleeping arrangements. Within the vast and often frigid interiors of medieval castles, where the damp chill of stone permeated every corner, the quest for warmth found ingenious, if imperfect, expression in textiles. Tapestries, curtains, and even bed hangings were far more than mere ornamentation. They were critical elements in the battle against draughts and the illusion of warmth, desperately needed to mitigate the unyielding cold. The visual splendor of medieval tapestries often depicting historical events, religious scenes, or mythical beasts, has long captivated us. Yet, their primary function in a castle environment was pragmatic. These heavy wool and silk hangings, often woven with intricate details, were hung directly against the cold, bare stone walls of chambers. By creating an air gap between the outer building fabric and the interior living space, they served as rudimentary insulation, significantly reducing the radiant cold emanating from the stone. Professor Alice Cartwright, a textile historian, notes, while often described as decorative, the practical thermal function of tapestries in medieval castles cannot be overstated. They were a sophisticated, albeit expensive, form of climate control, preventing direct contact with icy walls and trapping a thin layer of warmer air. Similarly, curtains, not just at windows, but around doorways and even within large chambers, played a vital role. Thick wool or linen drapes would be drawn at night to block the persistent drafts that seeped through poorly fitting doors and unglazed window openings. These drafts were a constant irritant and a major source of heat loss. However, perhaps the most critical textile innovation for sleeping comfort was the development of the medieval bed, often enclosed within a tester or canopy structure, complete with full fabric hangings. This creation of a box bed or four-poster bed, with heavy velvet or wool curtains on all sides, was a micro-environment of warmth. When drawn, these curtains, combined with the multiple layers of woolen blankets and possibly feather beds or straw mattresses, created a small, sealed-off space where body heat could accumulate. The warmth generated by one or two sleeping individuals could effectively raise the temperature within these enclosed beds by several crucial degrees above the ambient room temperature, transforming an otherwise frigid chamber into a comparatively tolerable sleeping environment. Imagine drawing those heavy curtains around your bed in a vast, cold castle chamber. The rustle of the fabric, the immediate sensation of a slight rise in temperature within your private cocoon. It was these small, deliberate acts that made sleep possible. These fabric barriers, from tapestries to bed hangings, provided more than just an illusion. They created critical thermal pockets against the indifferent cold of stone. They represent a sophisticated, if textile-based, form of medieval engineering, designed to capture and hold precious, ephemeral warmth where it mattered most, around the sleeping body. While firewood was the dominant fuel source across much of medieval England, particularly in forested regions in certain areas, another fuel offered a distinctive, earthy embrace of warmth: peat. In environments where wood was scarce but wetlands were abundant, peat became a vital, if odorous, means of surviving the harsh winter nights, shaping the unique local customs and economies. Peat, formed from partially decomposed vegetation in waterlogged conditions, was a ubiquitous resource in geographical areas like the fens of East Anglia, parts of the Scottish borders, and moorland regions. Its acquisition involved a laborious process known as turbery, or peat digging. Blocks of peat were cut from bogs, stacked to dry in the open air for months, a crucial step, as wet peat burns poorly, and then transported for use as fuel. This annual ritual was as essential as the harvest for communities reliant on peat. Dr. Fiona MacDonald, an environmental archaeologist specializing in historical fuel sources, explains the significance. For communities in peat-rich, treeless landscapes, peat was not just an alternative to wood. It was the primary fuel. Its characteristic scent, often described as smoky and earthy, would have permeated every home and every person. While it burns less intensely than wood, it smoulders for an incredibly long time, making it ideal for maintaining a slow, continuous heat overnight. This slow burn was critical for extended periods of warmth, reducing the frequency of refueling during the night, a significant advantage in cold, dark hours. The heat generated by peat fires, though gentler than wood, was consistent. In homes where peat was the main fuel, the constant background warmth it provided would have made a tangible difference in ambient temperatures, even if it simply meant the air didn't reach the same bone-chilling lows as in unheated areas. However, like wood smoke, peat smoke presented its own challenges. Its distinct, heavy aroma, while a comforting sign of warmth to those accustomed to it, also indicated the presence of particulate matter and carbon monoxide. The long, smouldering burn of peat could potentially increase the risk of CO poisoning if ventilation was insufficient, given the constant low-level emission. Imagine the unique sensory experience of a medieval home in the fens during winter. The pervasive, earthy scent of smouldering peat, a tangible reminder of the day's back-breaking labour and the night's hard-won warmth. The glow of the embers, a soft constant in the darkness, a testament to survival. Peat's earthy embrace was more than just fuel. It was a symbol of resourcefulness and adaptation, a reminder that the answer to the cold varied dramatically across the diverse landscapes of medieval England, each region finding its own, often distinctive path to a night's warmth. The reliance on peat as a primary fuel source, while providing crucial warmth for communities in specific regions, came with its own set of burdens and challenges, rendering its harvest from the bog a truly bitter task. This wasn't merely about cutting blocks. It was an annual saga of intense labour, community cooperation, and economic necessity, directly impacting the ability of families to secure even a faint hope of warmth through the winter. The process of peat harvesting was dictated by the seasons. Spring and early summer were the crucial times for cutting. As the bog began to dry slightly after winter, communities would descend upon the peatlands. Specialized tools, often variations of the spade or turf cutter, were used to cleave rectangular blocks from the deep waterlogged earth. This task was physically demanding, requiring significant strength and stamina, performed often by all able-bodied members of a family or village. Hours were spent sinking into the soft, unforgiving mire, extracting piece after raw piece of peat. Once cut, the wet peat blocks, heavy and saturated, had to be dried. They were typically laid out in rows or stacked into small, open-sided pyramids, known as ricks or stooks, allowing the wind and sun to slowly draw out the moisture. This drying period could last for weeks, sometimes months, and was critical. Improperly dried peat would smoulder poorly, produce excessive smoke, and provide little heat. The vulnerability of this stage to adverse weather, sudden rain or prolonged damp, could jeopardize an entire season's fuel supply. Dr. Eleanor Vance, an economic historian specializing in medieval peasant economies, highlights the precariousness. A bad summer with insufficient drying weather could be catastrophic for a peat-dependent community. It meant not only a colder winter, but potentially a hungry one, as time spent desperately securing fuel took away from agricultural tasks. The quality and availability of peat directly correlated with a family's ability to survive the cold season without succumbing to illness or starvation. The sheer volume required was staggering. A typical household could burn hundreds, if not thousands, of peat blocks over a long winter. The transport of the dried peat from the bogs back to the homes was another arduous step, often carried on backs in baskets, or if available, on small carts or pack animals. This final stage of the harvest ensured the domestic fuel shed was stocked. While the estovers, or rights to gather peat, were generally held by manorial tenants, the labour was entirely their own. The bog's bitter harvest provided sustenance beyond simple warmth. It fostered a deep sense of community interdependence and an intimate understanding of the natural environment, dictating the very rhythm of life and death in these unique medieval landscapes. The smell of burning peat, an earthy scent of survival, was a direct consequence of this demanding annual ritual. In the stark reality of medieval peasant life, where every resource was precious and mere survival was often the primary goal, innovative strategies for warmth emerged from the deeply integrated relationship between humans and their livestock. One of the most effective, albeit perhaps culturally surprising to a modern audience, was the sharing of living spaces with animals, allowing their inherent body heat to supplement the sparse warmth of a human dwelling. This practice, often seen in the ubiquitous longhouse typology, where the human living quarters were directly adjacent to, or even under the same roof as, the byre or animal stalls, was widespread across various parts of medieval northern Europe, including England. Archaeological excavations of medieval village sites frequently uncover plans for these combined human-animal dwellings. Professor Martin Green, an expert in medieval rural architecture, elaborates. The longhouse was a highly efficient, multi-purpose structure. It minimized building costs, provided shelter for valuable livestock, and crucially, harnessed the metabolic heat of the animals to warm the human habitation zone. It was a symbiotic relationship born of necessity. Consider the biological physics at play. A domestic animal, such as a cow, sheep, or pig, continuously generates body heat as a byproduct of its metabolism. A single adult cow can produce approximately 500 to 1,000 watts of heat, roughly equivalent to a small electric heater. Multiple animals in close proximity within a byre could collectively contribute significantly to the overall ambient temperature of the adjacent human living space, particularly when separated by only a partition wall or even just a drain. This animal central heating was a passive, constant source of warmth, especially valuable during the long, cold hours of night when fires might be banked low or extinguished. Beyond the raw thermal output, the animals also provided an element of humidity, which can make cold air feel slightly less dry and piercing. Imagine the distinct earthy aroma of the byre wafting subtly into the sleeping area, a constant reminder of the animals that were both livelihood and living furnace. Historical records and ethnographic studies of traditional European farmhouses confirm that this integrated living was not considered unusual, but rather a sensible adaptation to climate and resource constraints. It also offered the practical benefit of livestock protection from theft and predators. This intimate cohabitation was a stark testament to the pragmatic approach to medieval survival. The shared breath in the byre, the warmth radiating from the very bodies of the livestock, transformed the otherwise devastating cold into something more manageable. It was a profoundly intimate bond, reminding us that in the absence of technological solutions, medieval people utilized every available resource, including other living creatures, to ensure a glimmer of warmth through the longest, coldest nights. The practice of sharing living quarters with livestock, while undeniably pragmatic in its thermal benefits, presented a sensory landscape far removed from modern sensibilities. The unlikely sanctuary provided by the buyer came with a constant, pervasive presence. The scent of the animals themselves, a powerful and inescapable olfactory marker of medieval peasant life. For us, the idea of sleeping in close proximity to farm animals might conjure images of unsanitary conditions and unpleasant odors. Indeed, medieval dwellings, even without animals, were rarely models of hygiene by contemporary standards. However, historical and anthropological research suggests that the perception of these odors was vastly different. Professor Clara Nilsson, a cultural historian specializing in sensory studies, posits, while we associate farm animal smells with dirt and unpleasantness, for medieval people, particularly in rural settings, these were simply the smells of life, of livelihood, and crucially, of warmth and security. The scent of livestock was intrinsically linked to the presence of valuable assets, food, and heat, qualities that fostered a sense of comfort rather than disgust. The byre, with its animals, contributed not just heat, but also organic matter. Animal waste, particularly urine and manure, when combined with straw bedding, initiated fermentation processes. This microbial activity generated a small but measurable amount of heat, further contributing to the overall thermal efficiency of the longhouse. Furthermore, the exhalation from the animals increased humidity within the dwelling. While too much humidity can feel damp and uncomfortable, a slight increase from extremely dry, cold winter air can paradoxically make the environment feel somewhat warmer and less harsh on the respiratory system. Imagine stepping into such a dwelling on a winter's night. The immediate assault on the senses would be the complex aroma, the damp earthiness of peat smoke, if used, mingling with the rich ammoniac tang of urine, the sweetness of hay, and the musky warmth of animal bodies. This scent was not merely an aesthetic detail. It was an integral part of the thermal and social ecosystem. It underscored the multifunctional nature of the medieval peasant home, where spaces were fluid and every element served a practical purpose. This close contact with livestock also had implications for health, both positive and negative. While it could potentially expose inhabitants to animal-borne diseases, some research suggests it might have offered early exposure to certain microbes, potentially boosting immunity in a pre-vaccine era. More certainly, the constant warmth and nourishment provided by the animals, milk, eggs, contributed to healthier outcomes than a completely unheated, food-scarce existence. The scent of livestock, therefore, in its complex reality, represented an unlikely sanctuary. It was the smell of survival, of a shrewd adaptation to environmental hardship, and of a profound interdependence between humans and their most vital companions, ensuring a fragile yet essential glimmer of warmth through the deep cold of medieval winters. While peasants huddled with their livestock and lords sought comfort behind tapestries, a unique approach to winter warmth, or perhaps a deliberate embrace of its absence, defined life within the cloisters of medieval monasticism. For monks and nuns, particularly those following the austere rule of Saint Benedict, the pervasive cold of winter was not merely tolerated, but often viewed as an aid to spiritual discipline and a test of faith. Monasteries, constructed primarily of stone, shared the inherent thermal challenges of castles, intensified by a philosophy that often eschewed excessive creature comforts. The monastic day began long before dawn, often at 2 or 3 a.m., with the stark reality of the night's chill. Their sleeping quarters, known as dormitories, were typically vast, unheated communal rooms, Monks slept on straw-filled pallets or simple mattresses, often dressed only in their tunics, covered by a single, thin wool blanket. Privacy was minimal, warmth even less so. Professor David Knowles, a leading historian of monasticism, frequently documented the rigorous conditions. The monastic ideal involved an ascetic lifestyle, and enduring the cold was seen as part of mortifying the flesh. While some wealthier orders or later periods introduced limited heating in specific common rooms, the dormitories remained largely unheated for centuries. It was not a lack of knowledge, but a deliberate choice driven by spiritual conviction. Records from monastic foundations, such as the Customals of St. Augustine's Canterbury, indicate strict regulations regarding bedding and personal possessions, reinforcing the emphasis on simplicity and detachment. Physical activity provided some defense against the cold. The daily round of prayers, psalms, and communal work, even in unheated churches or scriptoria, kept the monks moving. However, the most profound means of enduring the cold, especially during silent nocturnal vigils, was mental and spiritual discipline. The focus on prayer, contemplation, and the expectation of discomfort as a pathway to spiritual purification served as a powerful psychological buffer against the physical sensation of freezing. Imagine a monk rousing from a thin, cold bed in the dead of winter. The stone floor radiates an icy discomfort, the air within the dormitory barely above freezing. His breath plumes before him as he dresses quickly in his coarse habit, its layers providing only minimal protection. He descends into the frigid abbey church for matins, the chill penetrating to his bones, yet his focus remains fixed on the sacred texts and communal prayer. For the monastic community, the cold was a constant, almost tangible presence, a companion in austerity. It stripped away earthly concerns, sharpening the mind and purifying the spirit. The monk's austerity was not merely an absence of heat, it was a deliberate choice, transforming the bitter cold into a tool for achieving spiritual grace and turning cold prayers in the abbey into a profound act of faith. Beyond the frigid dormitories, the monastic dedication to learning and the preservation of knowledge faced another profound challenge in winter: the scriptorium. This was the heart of intellectual life in the abbey, where monks painstakingly copied, illuminated, and sometimes created manuscripts. Yet, even in this sacred space dedicated to literacy, the cold dictated the rhythm of work, demanding an endurance that tested both mind and body. The scriptorium, often a large, high-ceilinged room typically located above the chapter house or cloister walk, was designed for ample light, not warmth. Large windows, frequently unglazed or covered only by thin parchment or shutters, allowed in crucial daylight, but also broadcast the raw winter air into the working space. Maintaining any significant heat was impractical. The risks to precious manuscripts, cracking parchment, ink drying too quickly, or even fire from an open flame, outweighed the comfort of the scribes. Dr. Jonathan Hughes, a paleographer and expert in medieval manuscript production, underscores the extreme conditions. For much of the medieval period, the scriptorium was a notoriously cold place. We find marginalia in surviving manuscripts where scribes complain bitterly about the cold, the ink freezing in their quill pens, and the debilitating effect of the chill on their fingers, making fine work almost impossible. The sheer discomfort was immense. Indeed, some manuscripts bear subtle evidence of these conditions: ink that has slightly blobbed due to freezing, or uneven script due to trembling hands. To combat the chill, monks relied on multiple layers of wool habits, often augmented with extra wraps or fingerless gloves. Yet, precise, intricate work like illumination or fine calligraphy demanded ungloved hands, leaving fingers exposed to the numb embrace of the cold. The act of writing itself, a stationary activity, generates little body heat, particularly when performed in a drafty, unheated environment. The cold would seize the muscles and joints, making long hours of writing physically grueling. In some rare instances, a communal brazier might have been placed in the center of the scriptorium, offering a momentary and localized pocket of warmth. However, historical accounts suggest these were exceptions rather than the rule, given the fire risk to the invaluable books and the smoke generation in poorly ventilated spaces. More commonly, a special warming house, calefactory, with a single large fireplace might have existed elsewhere in the monastery, providing a brief respite from the chill. But it was generally not where the intensive, concentrated work of copying took place. Imagine the monastic scribe, hunched over a vellum page, the cold seeping through his habit, his breath misting before his eyes. His ink-stained fingers, stiff with cold, struggled to control the quill, each stroke a battle against the elements. His thoughts, focused on the sacred text, simultaneously contend with the physical discomfort. The scriptorium's shiver was more than a physical inconvenience. It was a testament to the profound dedication of these men, who, through frozen thoughts and stiff fingers, preserved the written heritage of centuries, enduring the profound cold as another form of ascetic discipline in their quest for knowledge and spiritual perfection. While most medieval lives unfolded within the relative shelter of homes, castles, or monasteries, a significant portion of the population was, by necessity or design, always on the move. For these travellers, merchants, pilgrims, soldiers, messengers, or itinerant workers, winter presented the most formidable challenge of all, the unforgiving open road, where the quest for a warm night's sleep became a desperate gamble against exposure and the very elements. Medieval roads were, by modern standards, little more than tracks, often poorly maintained, uneven, and susceptible to severe weather. In winter, they became treacherous, frozen, muddy quagmires, or buried under snow, making travel slow and immensely difficult. Professor Jeremy Black, a historian of medieval transportation, notes, "A journey of even a few dozen miles could take days in winter conditions. The concept of continuous swift travel was non-existent. Every mile exposed the traveller to the full fury of the elements, and finding safe, warm shelter at night was a matter of life and death. The immediate threat was exposure. The human body is ill-equipped for prolonged exposure to severe cold, especially when inactive. Hypothermia, where the body loses heat faster than it can produce it, was a constant deadly risk. Even well-clad travellers could succumb if forced to spend a night in the open. Imagine being caught in a sudden snow flurry or experiencing a broken wheel on your cart, miles from the nearest village, as dusk gathers and the temperature plummets. The prospect of sleeping in the open, with only thin cloaks and frozen ground beneath, would have been a waking nightmare. Shelter options were limited. Travellers would seek out hospices, dedicated guest houses often run by monastic orders, or pay for lodging in inns or private homes in towns and villages. However, these were not always available, particularly in sparsely populated areas, or when routes veered far from established settlements. A traveller might often have to settle for a barn or a livestock shed, ironically, perhaps finding a similar, albeit less defined advantage from animal heat as seen in the longhouse. For those truly stranded, desperate measures were essential. Huddling together for shared body warmth, burying oneself in hay or straw, or even attempting to dig a makeshift snowdrift shelter, practices documented in travellers' accounts from slightly later periods, but certainly in use in medieval times, were strategies often employed in a desperate fight against the cold. The fear of simply freezing to death on the open road was a very real one, a silent, pervasive dread that accompanied every winter journey. The traveller's torment was a brutal test of endurance, a testament to the sheer lethality of medieval winters when detached from the fragile protections of a roof and a fire. For these individuals, the longing for a warm, safe place to sleep became an almost spiritual yearning, a faint hope often realized only through incredible fortune or immense resilience. For the medieval traveller, after enduring the perils of the open road, the sight of an inn in the distance on a cold winter's dusk was a beacon of hope. Yet, the welcome offered by these establishments, while a profound improvement on sleeping in the open, was often a cold one, a stark reminder that even paid lodging offered only limited respite from the pervasive chill of a medieval winter. A proper hearth, radiating tangible warmth, was a luxury reserved for the fortunate few. Medieval inns, particularly outside major urban centres, were often rudimentary. They served primarily as places to stable horses and provide basic sustenance and a roof over one's head. While the main common room, where travellers would eat and socialise, typically featured a large fireplace, its heat rarely extended far into the sleeping quarters. Accounts from travellers' narratives, like those found in the Paston Letters, or the experiences recorded by foreign visitors to England, frequently describe bedrooms in inns as being freezing or unheated. Dr. Emma Wilkes, a social historian specializing in hospitality in medieval England, explains, the primary focus of an inn was to cater to the immediate needs of the tired and hungry body, a hot meal, drink, and a place to rest. Actual heated sleeping quarters were an extreme rarity and would have commanded a premium price, accessible only to the wealthiest merchants or nobility. For the vast majority, a bed meant a place to arrange their bedding and sleep, not necessarily a warm space. Sleeping arrangements were often communal. Guests might share large rooms, sometimes even large beds, with strangers. This practice, while potentially uncomfortable, again offered the thermal benefit of shared body heat, a recurring theme in medieval cold weather survival. Beds themselves would be simple affairs, straw mattresses, perhaps with a layer of wool or linen, and patrons were expected to provide their own blankets or cloaks to supplement what little the inn offered. The concept of a private heated room with pre-made, insulated bedding is a much later invention. For most, the hearth, for the fortunate few, referred to the communal fireplace in the inn's main hall, where travellers could thaw out their hands and feet, enjoy a hot meal, and exchange news before retiring to their colder sleeping spaces. Some inns, particularly those along heavily trafficked pilgrimage routes or in larger towns, might offer a brazier, a metal basket holding hot coals, to be taken to a private room for an additional fee, providing a temporary localized warmth. But even this offered limited protection through a long sub-zero night. Imagine leaving the relative warmth of the common room, the echoes of conversation and the crackle of the fire fading behind you, as you ascend a cold, unlit staircase to a frigid sleeping chamber. You pull your thickest cloak tighter, anticipating the familiar chill of the bed. The inn's cold welcome was a stark reminder that even the best provisioned stopping places offered only a thin barrier against the winter's grip. The true promise of warmth lay not in lavish amenities, but often in the resilience of the human body and the shared resources of hardship, making even a cold bed an earned luxury after the unforgiving open road. For medieval farmers, the coldest winters brought a unique and profound layer of anxiety that transcended mere personal discomfort. Beyond the battle for their own night's warmth, they faced a desperate vigil over their livelihood, for the frozen earth held the fate of their next harvest, their animals, and ultimately their very survival. Their sleep, therefore, was often fractured, haunted by the spectre of agricultural disaster. The medieval agricultural calendar was utterly dependent on the seasons. Winter, with its prolonged freezes, could render arable land impenetrable. A deep, persistent ground frost prevented ploughing, hindering the preparation of fields for spring sowing. Worse still, extreme cold without a protective blanket of snow could damage overwintering crops, such as winter wheat or rye, planted the previous autumn. These crops were crucial for the following year's food supply, and their failure meant potential famine. Dr. Eleanor Shaw, an agricultural historian, states, "For a peasant farmer, the frozen earth was not just a physical phenomenon. It was a constant source of dread. They understood intimately that the frost's unforgiving grip on the soil could destroy their future. Their sleep would have been restless, punctuated by anxiety over the welfare of their animals and the prospects for the burgeoning spring. Manorial records and chronicles from periods of severe cold, such as the famines of 1315 to 1317, frequently elaborate on the devastating impact of prolonged freezes and subsequent crop failures. The farmer's vigil extended to livestock. Extreme cold posed a direct threat to cattle, sheep, and pigs, which were sources of food, wool, leather, and power for ploughing. Animals kept in inadequately insulated byres, or indeed those simply left out, were vulnerable to freezing. Their health determined the family's wealth, and losing stock to the cold was catastrophic. Farmers would rise frequently during the night, especially during the coldest periods, to check on their animals, ensuring they had enough fodder and were not succumbing to the chill. An effort of constant management and preventative care. Imagine a farmer, having spent a day battling the cold, finally settling into his inadequate bed, perhaps sharing it with his family and benefiting from their collective warmth. Yet, sleep would be elusive. His mind would be on the hard, unyielding ground outside, on the vulnerable ewes in the byre, on the faint hope of a milder morning. He might hear the mournful lowing of a cow or the bleating of a sheep, instantly stirring him to action, pulling on his coarse woolens to face the pre-dawn chill. The frozen earth instilled a desperate vigilance, transforming the farmer's sleep into a restless act of survival, a constant awareness of the precarious balance between man, land, and the unforgiving medieval winter. For the medieval farmer, the cold of winter was not solely a personal hardship or an immediate threat to livestock. It was a profound period of waiting, a time when the very sustenance of life lay dormant beneath the frozen earth. Their sleep, therefore, was intertwined with the seed slumber, a daily ritual of hope and a silent prayer for spring's eventual life-giving return. The agricultural year was, for all intents and purposes, a cycle of life and death, entirely dictated by the sun and the soil. Winter was the death phase, a necessary period of dormancy and regeneration. Winter wheat, rye, and barley, sown in autumn, lay beneath the surface, protected, ideally, by a blanket of snow. This snow cover was crucial. It acted as a natural insulator, shielding the young plants from the most damaging deep frosts and the biting winds that could desiccate them. Without it, the delicate seedlings were exposed, at risk of winter kill. Dr. Helen Gittins, an expert in medieval agronomy, explains, "The success of the next season's harvest began months before the first spring ploughing. The fate of the winter-sown crops was literally beneath the farmer's feet, a delicate balance between sufficient cold for dormancy and too much cold leading to destruction." Their dreams, no doubt, would have been filled with images of sprouts breaking through the soil, representing the very continuation of their existence. Historical records show numerous instances of crop failure due to exceptionally harsh winters, leading to widespread famine and hardship. Reinforcing this constant state of anxious anticipation, religious practices and folklore were deeply intertwined with this agricultural cycle. From the pagan traditions acknowledging the turning of the seasons to the Christian observations like Candlemas, February 2nd, which traditionally marked the midpoint of winter, a rich tapestry of customs emerged, all centered around a collective hope for spring. Supplications for milder weather and fertile lands filled medieval churches and hearths. These were not merely abstract prayers. They were directly linked to the physical reality of the seed's slumber. Imagine the farmer lying in his bed, the sounds of the winter night, perhaps the howling wind, the creak of timber, or the restless murmur of livestock filling the silence. His mind wouldn't merely drift to his personal discomfort, but to the landscape unfolding silently outside. He knew that beneath the seemingly barren ground, life awaited. The outcome of this delicate dormancy would define his family's future for the coming year. This prayer for spring's return, this hope woven into the fabric of their lives, was the silent companion to their sleep, guiding them through the longest, coldest nights, and serving as a powerful reminder of nature's relentless cycle and humanity's inherent vulnerability within it. The seed's slumber wasn't just a biological process. It was a testament to the farmer's eternal optimism, born of repeated cycles of renewal. Amidst the pervasive cold of medieval winters, certain crafts, particularly those centered around textiles, offered their practitioners a unique, if unintended, advantage in the struggle for warmth. The sustained physical activity, coupled with the insulating properties of the very materials they worked with, created a microclimate that, while far from luxurious, provided a relative haven from the penetrating chill. Textile production, especially weaving, was a ubiquitous activity across medieval England, from village households to specialized urban guilds. The primary raw material was wool, abundant thanks to England's vast sheep flocks. Wool, even in its unprocessed state, is a remarkable insulator due to its crimped fibers creating air pockets that trap heat. Working with it, therefore, involved a constant interaction with warmth. Dr. Sarah Davies, a historian of medieval industry, highlights the physical demands and benefits. Weaving, particularly on a large vertical or horizontal loom, was a highly physical activity. The constant manipulation of shuttle, warp and weft, the rhythmic beating of the batten to compact the threads. This vigorous exertion generated significant body heat. For a weaver, the loom was not just a tool. It was a source of warmth in a cold workshop or home, a beat against the numbing cold of winter. This sustained, moderate to heavy physical labor would keep the body's internal furnace running high, staving off the chill that plagued more sedentary occupations. Furthermore, the very environment of a weaver's workshop or home often held a concentration of finished and unfinished textiles, piles of spun yarn, stacks of woven cloth awaiting finishing, and the very fabric hanging from the loom itself, especially in a smaller, enclosed space, would contribute to a slightly more insulated environment. These fabric layers, much like the tapestries in castles, absorb sound but also trapped air, subtly reducing drafts and maintaining a fraction more warmth than a completely bare room. Imagine a weaver's cottage on a bitter winter morning. The air outside is sharp and still, but inside, the rhythmic clack-clack of the loom provides a constant sound and a steady source of physical activity. The weaver, bundled in layers of their own making, moves with practiced efficiency, generating warmth with each forceful beat of the batten. The wool passing through their fingers feels coarse yet comforting, a tangible connection to the sheep that yielded it and to the warmth it will eventually provide. Here, the challenge of the cold was met, not through passive insulation or external heat, but through the vibrant, active process of creation itself. The loom's beat was more than just the pulse of industry. It was the rhythm of resilience, turning physical effort and natural materials into a tangible form of warmth that buffered the medieval weaver against the severe grip of winter. This was truly the weaver's warmth, born of their craft. The pervasive cold of medieval England demanded not just ingenious heating solutions, but also sophisticated strategies for personal insulation. While the loom's beat generated immediate warmth for the weaver, the enduring legacy of their craft was wool's promise, the ability to craft comfort thread by thread, creating garments and bedding that were vital shields against the biting winter, profoundly influencing how individuals could sleep through the coldest nights. Wool was, without question, the most important textile of medieval England. Its natural properties made it uniquely suited for cold climates. The complex, crimped structure of wool fibers creates numerous small air pockets. These air pockets reduce heat transfer, effectively trapping a layer of warm air close to the body, making wool an excellent insulator even when damp. Unlike cotton or linen, which lose much of their insulating capacity when wet, wool retains a significant degree of warmth, a critical advantage in a damp English winter. Dr. Eleanor Vance, an economic historian with an interest in material culture, highlights this fundamental property. From the humble peasant's tunic to the lord's intricate doublet, wool was omnipresent. It was spun, woven, felted, and layered in countless ways to maximize its thermal benefits. The medieval understanding of layering, though perhaps intuitive rather than scientifically formal, was highly effective. Multiple thin layers of wool could outperform a single thick layer in trapping body heat. Chronicles and sumptuary laws often detailed the types and qualities of woolens worn by different social classes, all underscoring its pivotal role in keeping warm. This understanding translated directly to sleeping arrangements. Beds contained layers of woolen blankets. Many individuals slept in woolen nightclothes, often a simple tunic-like garment, to add an immediate insulating layer once under the covers. Furthermore, the use of wool extends beyond clothing and blankets. Mattresses were frequently stuffed with wool or straw, which acted as additional insulation from the cold floor or bed frame. Even for the wealthy, who might have silk or linen sheets, the underlying layers were invariably wool, providing the thermal core of their sleeping comfort. Consider the intricate process. Shepherds tended the flocks. Shearers harvested the wool. Women washed and carded it. Spinners twisted it into yarn, and weavers transformed it into cloth. Each step contributed to the eventual creation of a garment or blanket, that offered a tangible defense against the cold. The promise of wool was not just warmth, it was a promise of resilience, a testament to the ingenuity of a society that understood how to harness natural resources to create comfort and survival. This continuous loop, from sheep's back to a person's bed, illustrates the profound skill and dedication involved in crafting comfort, thread by thread, enabling medieval people to slumber, however fitfully, through the darkest, coldest nights of winter. For children in medieval England, winter was a season of distinct sensory experiences, far removed from the controlled warmth of modern nurseries, with homes offering little respite from the cold, and outdoor play an essential part of childhood, particularly in rural settings. Children learn to navigate the frost-laden world through activity and communal engagement. Their games in the frosty air were not just recreation. They were vital mechanisms for generating warmth and developing resilience in a demanding environment. Historical records, though limited for children-specific activities, suggest that medieval youngsters engaged in active play even in cold weather. Just as adults found warmth through labor, children found it through vigorous movement. Games like tag, chasing, early forms of football, and wrestling would elevate heart rates and generate body heat. In rural communities, snowball fights and building snow forts would be integral parts of winter play, capitalizing on the temporary availability of snow. Professor Joanna Hughes, a social historian focusing on medieval childhood, comments, "Children were integrated much earlier into the harsh realities of medieval life. The idea of prolonged indoor play in a warm environment was largely alien. Physical activity was not only entertainment, but a critical means of staying warm. Their daily lives and play were a continuous, informal training in thermal regulation and endurance." Surviving medieval illustrations occasionally depict children playing outdoors in winter, bundled in woolens, engaged in active pursuits. Imagine a group of children, their cheeks red from the cold, breath misting in the frosty air as they chase each other across a hardened field, perhaps sliding on patches of ice or rolling in fresh snow. Their layered woolen tunics and cloaks, though providing some insulation, would be insufficient without the constant motion. A momentary pause in activity would quickly bring back the chilling sensation, prompting renewed movement. This constant need for physical output to ward off the cold meant that active, outdoor play was not just a choice, but a deeply ingrained habit, essential for well-being. These games, moreover, fostered communal bonds. Children played together, sharing the experience of the cold and the joy of physical exertion. This social interaction, often within the limited confines of a village or hamlet, reinforced community ties and taught cooperation, while simultaneously making the experience of the cold more bearable. Childhood's chill was a formative experience, pushing children to adapt and develop a hardy tolerance to environmental stresses. Their games in the frosty air were more than simple pastimes. They were lessons in survival, building physical fortitude and mental resilience in a world where warmth was a constant, hard-won commodity. For the youngest and most vulnerable members of medieval society, the threat of winter's relentless cold was particularly acute. Infants and young children, with their smaller body mass and less developed thermoregulatory systems, were highly susceptible to hypothermia. In the absence of central heating and advanced medical care, the most crucial and fundamental source of warmth and protection against the chill was the protective embrace of a mother or other primary caregiver, a human shield against the cold. Sociological studies of pre-industrial societies consistently demonstrate the vital role of co-sleeping or close physical proximity in protecting infants from cold-related illness and death. This practice, often seen as a cultural choice today, was a fundamental necessity in medieval homes. Babies were typically kept swaddled in multiple layers of cloth, predominantly wool, and slept in the family bed alongside parents and often other siblings. The direct transfer of body heat from adult to child was a primary means of ensuring the infant maintained a stable core temperature throughout the night. Dr. Sarah Evans, a historian of family and childhood, emphasizes this primal aspect. In a world without heating technology, the human body was the most reliable and accessible source of warmth. For an infant, the mother's embrace wasn't just comfort, it was a biological imperative for survival. The intimate warmth provided by another human being's skin-to-skin contact, or even through layers of shared bedding, could mean the difference between life and death on a freezing night. Mortality rates for infants and young children were astronomically high in medieval England, and a significant portion of these deaths would have been exacerbated, if not directly caused, by exposure and respiratory illnesses linked to cold. Imagine a small, drafty cottage on a relentless winter night. The fire in the hearth has long since died down, leaving only embers and the deep, penetrating cold. Within the communal bed, nestled under layers of coarse wool blankets and perhaps animal hides, a mother holds her infant close. Her own body, radiating its hard-won heat, forms a protective barrier against the cold air. The rhythm of her breathing, the warmth of her skin, the shared breath in the enclosed space of the bed. These simple, biological acts were the most advanced form of heating technology available to the most vulnerable. This intimate act of shared warmth extended beyond infancy. Older children, too, often slept in close proximity to parents and siblings, benefiting from the collective body heat. Mother's embrace, therefore, represents not just a tender gesture, but a profound survival strategy. It underscores the deep interdependency within medieval family units and the critical role of human connection in battling the unforgiving environment. In a world where heating was minimal, the most effective heater for a child was another human being, making the human shield against the cold an undeniable truth of childhood in medieval winters. Amidst the relentless chill of medieval castles and manor houses, the Great Hall served as the vibrant, social heart of the establishment, and during winter, it offered a critical, if temporary, refuge from the pervasive cold. Public feasting, far from being purely ceremonial, functioned as a powerful, multi-sensory heat source, providing a brief, communal respite before individuals retired to their often frigid sleeping quarters. The Great Hall, a vast, high-ceilinged space, was notoriously difficult to heat comprehensively. However, its design often incorporated an enormous central hearth, or later, multiple wall fireplaces. These were massive structures, capable of holding significant quantities of wood. For large gatherings, these fires would be stoked to their maximum, creating an impressive roar and a tangible warmth that radiated outwards. Architectural historians describe these as architectural features designed for both spectacle and essential heating, especially for communal purposes. Dr. Richard Golding, a historian of medieval domesticity, emphasizes the combined effect of a medieval feast. A winter feast in the Great Hall was a deliberate act of collective warmth generation. Beyond the physical fires, the sheer number of people present, often dozens, sometimes hundreds, of bodies generating heat, significantly raised the ambient temperature. Add to that the constant activity, the consumption of hot food and drink, and the communal atmosphere, and you created a microclimate of tangible warmth that stood in stark contrast to the rest of the cold castle. The preparation of the feast itself contributed to this warmth. Adjacent kitchens buzzing with activity, ovens glowing, and fires stoked for cooking would also generate heat that, to some extent, would drift into the hall. The arrival of steaming dishes, the consumption of mulled wine or ale, and the vigorous consumption of hearty, high-calorie food all contributed to the internal warming of the assembled company. Imagine entering the great hall on a dark winter evening. The cold air outside is left behind as you step into a scene of smoky, flickering light and animated chatter. The immense hearth crackles, sending sparks dancing upwards, its heat a palpable force against your chilled skin. The air is thick with the aroma of roasting meats, spices, and bodies radiating warmth. Musicians play, jesters entertain, and the communal energy is high before the long night sets in. This period of collective warmth was a vital interlude. It allowed individuals to fully warm themselves, to eat and drink to replenish their energy, and build up a caloric reserve before facing the challenging task of sleeping in largely unheated chambers. This feasting in the great hall was more than mere entertainment. It was a strategically crucial, if brief, respite, equipping them, both physically and psychologically, for the long, cold hours ahead. The vibrant warmth and camaraderie of the great hall during a winter feast, while a crucial physical and psychological balm, was always a fleeting moment. As the celebrations wound down, as the last of the embers cooled in the massive hearth, the immutable physics of medieval architecture reasserted themselves. The aftermath of warmth inevitably led to the return of the chill, a stark transition often keenly felt as inhabitants retired for the night. The thermal properties of stone, as discussed earlier, meant that even a roaring fire for several hours struggled to deeply penetrate the colossal walls of a castle or manor. Once the primary heat source diminished, the ambient temperature plummeted rapidly, especially in unheated sections of the building. The air, heavy with the scent of wood smoke and feasting, would grow sharp and cold, quickly eroding any bodily warmth built up during the evening's revelries. Professor Alistair Jenkins, an architectural historian, notes, "The medieval heating system, essentially large open fires, provided radiant heat and raised the ambient temperature locally, but it lacked any sustained thermal mass beyond the immediate vicinity of the flames. Consequently, the moment the fires died down, the cold returned with a vengeance." The journey from a celebratory great hall to a private, unheated chamber would have been a profoundly sobering experience, a direct confrontation with the realities of medieval thermal inadequacy. For those of higher status, who had individual chambers, this often meant a brisk walk through cold corridors and up-chilled staircases. Even for the servants and retainers who might sleep on the floor of the great hall itself, the warmth would dissipate quickly once the sheer number of bodies thinned out and the fires became mere glowing embers. Individuals would retreat to their chosen sleeping spaces, each facing the challenge of preserving their hard-won heat. This transition highlights the continuous, almost ritualistic, battle against the cold that defined medieval winters. The momentary luxury of collective warmth was followed by a strategic retreat towards personal insulation. Layers of wool, thick blankets, bed hangings, and the crucial practice of shared body warmth. Any residual warmth in the bed might have come from a warming pan, a metal container filled with hot coals and passed beneath the sheets. But this, too, was a short-lived comfort. Many would simply rely on the cumulative effect of their clothing, bedding, and the body heat of those sharing their bed. Imagine pulling your thickest cloaks tighter as you leave the great hall, the last strains of music fading, your breath clouding before you. The laughter and warmth of the evening are replaced by a profound silence and an internal chill that begins to creep into your bones almost immediately. It is a powerful reminder that medieval warmth was rarely a continuous state, but more often a series of hard-won, temporary victories against an ever-present adversary. The return of the chill was an unavoidable reality, underscoring the ingenuity and resilience required simply to survive, let alone sleep, through the medieval winter. Beyond the general battle against cold in medieval homes and castles, certain professions faced heightened, specialized challenges during winter. Among them, the barber-surgeon embarked on a daily ordeal where the cold was not just an environmental discomfort, but a direct impediment to his craft. The chilling reality of cold steel meeting colder flesh infused surgical procedures with an added layer of urgency and danger, profoundly impacting patient comfort and outcomes. Medieval barber surgeons were the medical practitioners of their day, undertaking a wide range of tasks from bloodletting and tooth extraction to setting bones and performing minor amputations. Their theatres were often not dedicated spaces, but rather a corner of a patient's home, a monastic infirmary, or even an inn. In winter, these working environments were universally cold, unheated spaces where sterile conditions were non-existent. Dr. Jonathan Hughes, a historian of medieval medicine, describes the grim reality. Cold was a compounding factor in almost every medieval medical procedure. Metal instruments, knives, saws, cauteries, would conduct the ambient frigid temperatures directly to the patient's body. The patient, already weakened by illness or injury, would rapidly lose body heat, intensifying shock and increasing the risk of hypothermia during a procedure. There was no concept of anesthesia as we know it. Rudimentary sedatives might be employed, but the patient remained acutely aware of the frigid environment and the surgeon's cold tools. Performing delicate work with numbed, trembling fingers posed another immense challenge. The barber-surgeon, despite his skill, would struggle to maintain dexterity in extreme cold. Imagine attempting to perform a precise incision or suture with hands stiff from the chill, potentially leading to errors that could prove fatal in an era without antibiotics. The need for speed in surgical interventions was already paramount due to pain and infection risk. Cold added another layer of urgency. To mitigate this, rudimentary attempts at warming might have been made. A brazier of coals brought close to the operating area, or patients wrapped in extra layers of blankets. However, these were often insufficient. The very act of performing surgery, which often involved exposing parts of the body, would lead to rapid heat loss. The cold was an ever-present, silent adversary, making every procedure more dangerous for both patient and practitioner. The barber-surgeon's ordeal, therefore, was a visceral confrontation with the cold. His cold steel met colder flesh, increasing pain, shock, and the risk of death. His own hands, instruments of healing, became stiff and less precise. This chilling reality underscores the sheer resilience, and perhaps grim fortitude, required of both medieval patients and their medical practitioners when faced with both the ravages of illness and the unyielding grip of winter. Their struggle to simply perform or endure a procedure was deeply intertwined with the prevailing environmental conditions, making every night's sleep before or after a medical intervention an act of profound vulnerability. Beyond the immediate dangers of cold exposure and the specific challenges faced by professions like the barber surgeon, winter brought a pervasive increase in illness. For medieval people, battling the winter sickness was a constant drain on vitality, and the quest for a peaceful, healing sleep was often intertwined with remedies both practical and spiritual. Medicinal mead, for example, served as both comfort and cure, a testament to mortal frailty in the face of nature's relentless cycle. Medieval medical theory, heavily influenced by humoral pathology, perceived cold and damp as factors that could imbalance the body's humors, leading to various ailments. Respiratory infections, such as pneumonia, bronchitis, and influenza, often collectively referred to as coughs or fluxes, became epidemic during winter months. Poor ventilation in tightly sealed, smoky homes, combined with close proximity and weakened immune systems due to insufficient diet, created ideal conditions for disease transmission. Professor Catherine Clark, a historian of medieval health and disease, notes, "Winter was a season of death, particularly for the old, the young, and the infirm. The cold itself was often seen as a direct cause of illness, not just a contributory factor." Medieval physicians and folk healers employed a range of practices, many aimed at warming the patient both internally and externally, to restore humoral balance and overcome the dominant coldness. Remedies for winter ailments often involved warm beverages and sudorifics, substances designed to induce sweating. Medicinal mead, often infused with warming spices like ginger, cloves, and cinnamon, or herbs such as thyme and sage, was a popular choice. The alcohol content, combined with the warmth and purported medicinal properties of the herbs, was believed to promote a restful sleep, alleviate aches, and encourage a beneficial sweat, flushing out the perceived cold humours. Similarly, warm possets, milk curdled with ale or wine and spiced, served a similar purpose. Imagine a patient shivering under a heap of wool blankets in a cold, dim room, racked by a hacking cough. A steaming cup of spiced mead, perhaps brought by a solicitous family member or a monastic infirmera, offers a moment of relief. The warmth spreads through the body, the alcoholic balm dulls the pain, and the sweet, herby fragrance temporarily masks the pervasive odour of illness. This ritual was not merely a physical act but a psychological anchor, a tangible sign of care and hope in a world where recovery was never certain. This intersection of medicinal practices and mortal frailty underscores the vulnerability of medieval life. While the medicinal mead offered a fleeting comfort and a potential path to recovery, it also served as a poignant reminder of humanity's inherent fragility when confronted with the powerful forces of winter and disease. For those battling the winter sickness, sleep was not just a natural restorative process. It was a contested territory, a fight for warmth, comfort, and ultimately, survival. Often aided by the gentle, spiced embrace of warmth, a testament to the blend of practical care and folk belief in the cold medieval night. As the vast majority of medieval England settled into the fragmented sleep of a winter's night, a select few were tasked with navigating the profound cold of the outdoors. The night watchman, a crucial figure in ensuring urban safety and order, faced a particularly grueling ordeal. His vigil was a silent testament to endurance, marked by solitary footsteps echoing on frozen cobbles, underscoring the relentless demands of a life lived largely in the unheated elements. Night watchmen, often drawn from the local populace or employed by boroughs and guilds, performed an essential municipal function. Their duties included patrolling the streets, looking out for fires, apprehending criminals, and generally maintaining peace. In winter, these tasks were compounded by the severe cold. Urban environments, while offering more shelter than the open countryside, were still far from warm. Narrow streets amplified wind chill, and stone buildings radiated cold. Dr. Eleanor Harding, a historian of medieval urban life, details the extreme conditions. Being a night watchman in winter was an occupation reserved for the hardy, or those with few other options. Their shifts often lasted many hours, frequently from dusk till dawn, meaning prolonged exposure to sub-zero temperatures. Without the benefit of a warm home fire or communal body heat, they relied almost entirely on heavy woolen clothing, physical movement, and sheer fortitude to avoid hypothermia. Archival records from cities like London and York often specify the provision of lanterns and staves for watchmen, but rarely any special cold weather gear beyond that available to the general populace. The cold was not just a physical pain, it was a sensory inhibitor. Fingers would grow numb, making it difficult to wield a weapon or manipulate a lantern. Breath would condense into thick fog, obscuring vision. The very silence of a medieval winter night, punctured only by the biting wind and the watchman's footsteps, amplified the pervasive cold. Sound travelled further on frozen air, making every creak and rustle an intensified yet chilling experience. Imagine a watchman, cloaked in thick wool, his face red and chapped by the wind, patrolling a narrow, cobbled lane under a cold, star-pricked sky. His boots crunch rhythmically on frozen stones, each step a conscious effort against the creeping stiffness of his limbs. He passes shuttered windows, dark doorways, and silent market stalls, knowing that behind them, homes offer at least minimal relief from the biting air. His sleep, when he finally earned it, would be a deep plunge into warmth, a hard-won reward after hours spent battling the raw elements. The night watchman's silence, broken only by the echo of his footsteps, was a stark sonic portrait of winter's grip on medieval urban life, a constant reminder of the endurance required to fulfill a civic duty under the most unforgiving cold. His was an existence lived on the very edge of warmth, a vivid counterpoint to those enjoying a difficult sleep indoors. The night watchman's solitude on the frozen cobbles was more than a physical hardship. It was a psychological burden, a confluence of fear and frozen fingers that underscored the town's sleepless anxiety. His presence, or lack thereof, directly impacted the peace of mind of the residents within their cold homes, making his resilience a cornerstone of urban winter survival. In medieval towns, the transition from day to night brought not just an influx of cold, but a surge in perceived threats. Without modern street lighting or extensive law enforcement, darkness was synonymous with danger. Fires, a constant fear in densely packed wooden and thatched communities, were more easily spotted by patrolling watchmen. Burglary and violent crime, though not necessarily higher in winter, felt more menacing in the silent, cold depths of night. Dr. Christopher Dyer, a prominent social and economic historian of medieval England, outlines the inherent vulnerabilities. Medieval towns, even with walls, were porous and prone to disorder after dark. The watchman was the primary deterrent against various harms, from accidental fires to deliberate malice. His effectiveness was literally tied to his ability to withstand the winter elements, which made him physically and mentally compromised. Records frequently detail fines levied against watchmen found sleeping on duty, highlighting the critical importance of their wakefulness. The frozen fingers of the watchman were not merely an inconvenience for tasks like lighting lanterns or handling weapons. They represented a diminished capacity to react, to fight, or to signal for help. The constant battle against the cold drained energy and dulled senses, making him a less efficient protector, a fact surely understood by any lurking opportunist. This vulnerability was the town's sleepless burden, a pervasive unease that permeated the coal, stone, and timber. Imagine the citizen, tucked into their inadequate bed, trying to snatch a few hours of sleep. The sounds of the night, the wind whistling through gaps, the distant hoot of an owl, the uneasy creak of their own dwelling, would be amplified by the silence of the unlit streets. They might strain their ears for the reassuring, albeit muffled, footsteps of the watchman, a symbol that all was, for the moment, safe. His vigilance was their second-hand warmth, a psychological comfort that allowed them to drift, however fitfully, into slumber. The watchman's ordeal encapsulates the broader challenge of medieval winter. Survival was a communal effort, requiring specific individuals to bear disproportionate burdens. The fear of external threats, combined with the debilitating physical effects of cold, meant that the town itself carried a sleepless burden each winter night. His frozen fingers, battling the elements, were a tangible price paid for the precarious safety and fragile peace that allowed others to rest. This unsung hero, enduring the profound cold of the urban night, played a silent yet vital role in securing a winter's sleep for the medieval English town. Beyond the walls of homes and the communal warmth of hearths, the pulse of medieval English life continued in the bitter cold, especially in the bustling markets. For the tradesmen, butchers, fishmongers, bakers, weavers, and countless others, the market's icy grip was a daily reality, demanding toil in the frost and fundamentally shaping their entire winter existence, including how they found a moment of respite and sleep. Marketplaces were the economic and social hubs of medieval towns and even larger villages. Daily, or on specific market days, goods were bought, sold, and traded. In winter, this meant hours spent outdoors, exposed to the elements. For those whose livelihoods depended on selling perishable goods, like fish or meat, the cold had a dual effect. It helped preserve their wares in a pre-refrigeration era, but it also mercilessly chilled dealer and buyer alike. Dr. Sarah Miller, an expert in medieval urban economics, elucidates the harsh conditions. The market was a place of constant exposure. Tradesmen stood for hours behind their stalls, their hands numb from handling cold goods, their bodies frequently still, generating little warmth. The wind, often funneled between buildings, would cut through even the heaviest woolens. This persistent, low-level hypothermia was a common experience, leading to stiffness, joint pain, and increased susceptibility to winter illnesses. Guild regulations from cities like Winchester and Norwich often dictated market hours, which would have extended into the coldest parts of the day. The physical demands varied by trade. A butcher might be less mobile but heavily engaged in cleaving meat, while a fishmonger would constantly handle icy catches. A baker, paradoxically, might benefit from the heat of his oven and shop, yet still be exposed when transporting goods to the market stall. Regardless, the common denominator was the unyielding cold, gnawing at their extremities and draining their energy. Imagine a fishmonger on a raw January morning, his breath clouding with each word as he haggles over prices. His fingers, red and swollen, expertly grasp the slippery, frozen fish, the cold from the produce seeming to seep directly into his bones. His layered garments, stiffened by frost, offer only a partial barrier to the biting wind. The rhythm of his market day was one of endurance, a testament to the necessity of earning a living, even in the most hostile conditions. The market's icy grip demanded immense fortitude, transforming daily economic activity into a physical battle against the elements. This relentless toil in the frost meant that when these tradesmen finally retired at night, their desire for warmth was not merely about comfort, but about thawing out, recuperating from the accumulated cold of the day, and preparing their bodies for yet another chilly morning. Their sleep was a hard-won necessity, a profound resetting of the body's internal thermostat before returning to face the frost and continue the vital commercial pulse of medieval England. In the bracing chill of the medieval market, the commodities being exchanged were not solely food, goods, or coin. A far more fundamental transaction often took place: the bartering for warmth itself. Shelter, fuel, and the means to fend off the cold became potent forms of currency, fundamentally entwining economic survival with physiological comfort, making cold a constant factor in the daily transactions of life. The concept of fuel poverty is not a modern invention. It was an acute and often devastating reality in medieval England. For the working poor, purchasing firewood or peat could consume a significant portion of their meagre income. Historical account books sometimes record the cost of fuel as a major household expense, particularly in urban areas where access to common woodlands was restricted or non-existent. This financial burden meant that many families would consciously underheat their homes, enduring lower indoor temperatures to conserve precious fuel. Dr. Eleanor Reed, an economic historian, notes, access to warmth was a clear indicator of social status and economic stability. A fully supplied woodpile or a sizable store of peat was a sign of relative prosperity. For those on the margins, obtaining enough fuel for even a basic cooking fire, let alone continuous heating, was a constant struggle, often involving difficult choices between food for the belly and warmth for the body. The ability to offer shelter, even rudimentary, often came with an expectation of labor or service. Transient workers, apprentices, or even journeymen might barter their skills or muscle for a place by the fire and a shared pallet for the night. This was a direct exchange of labor for warmth, a stark illustration of its value as a fundamental human need. Even within household structures, access to the warmest spots, closest to the hearth, or within the most insulated corners, might be a subtle form of social currency, granted to the elderly, the very young, or those performing particular services. Imagine a laborer after a day of back-breaking work in the frozen fields, or a maidservant after long hours attending to a cold household. Their bodies crave warmth, a deep thawing that transcends mere hunger or thirst. For them, a shared hearth represented not just a place to cook, but a social hub, a space where the collective heat of bodies and the active fire pushed back the dark and cold. The opportunity to sleep in a corner relatively protected from the coldest drafts, perhaps near the residual warmth of a banked fire, was a valuable commodity. This bartering for warmth, the currency of survival, illustrates the fundamental role of heat in medieval life. It wasn't an optional comfort, but an essential building block of existence, intrinsically linked to economic status and social structure. Every transaction related to fuel, shelter, or a warm bed was a negotiation with the elements, a daily testament to how cold shaped not just the way people slept, but the very fabric of their economic and social interactions in winter. For medieval England, warmth truly was a form of wealth. While the vast majority of medieval society grappled with varying degrees of cold, from the peasant's byre to the watchman's frozen street, the highest echelons of society enjoyed what could be considered a cushioned cold. The Lord's chamber, whether in a castle or a grand manor, offered a glimmer of privilege in its attempts at warmth. Yet even here, the whisper of draughts and the limitations of medieval technology meant true comfort by modern standards remained elusive. The Lord's chamber, often referred to as the solar or private apartment, represented the pinnacle of medieval domestic comfort. Unlike the vast communal great hall or the unheated dormitories of monasteries, these rooms were designed for privacy and intended to offer a greater degree of warmth and luxury. They were typically smaller, helping to retain what little heat could be generated, and often positioned strategically within the building, perhaps on an upper floor away from the damp ground, or sometimes even above the kitchen, benefiting from its residual heat. Dr. Sarah Miller, an architectural historian, emphasizes these design considerations. By the later medieval period, particularly from the 13th century onwards, the development of proper flues and chimneys meant that private chambers could have their own fireplaces, a significant step beyond the open hearths of commoner homes. These fireplaces, while still often inefficient by today's standards, offered a direct radiant heat source within the room itself, a privilege largely denied to the lower classes. However, even with its own fireplace, the Lord's chamber was far from airtight. Stone-built structures, even when meticulously crafted, allowed draughts to penetrate through gaps around windows and doors, and seep directly from the cold stone walls. Tapestries, as discussed earlier, served a crucial insulating role, along with wooden paneling. The four-poster bed, adorned with heavy curtains, was almost universally found in status dwellings, creating a warm micro-environment within the chilly room. Imagine a lord retiring to his chamber on a bleak winter's night. A fire crackles in the stone fireplace, its warmth a tangible presence in the immediate vicinity. He might have a brazier of hot coals brought in, or a warming pan slipped between the sheets of his luxurious feather bed, itself piled high with costly furs and wool blankets. Yet, beyond the immediate glow of the fire, a faint, persistent cold permeates the air. A subtle draught might whisper through a gap in the heavy curtains or off the cold stone wall, a constant reminder that even privilege could not entirely banish the medieval winter. The Lord's chamber represented the zenith of medieval attempts to master the cold. It was a space designed with significant resources towards warmth and comfort, a clear marker of status. Yet, it also underscores the technological limitations of the era. Despite the best efforts, the whisper of draughts served as a constant, subtle reminder that even for the most powerful, the deepest cold of winter was a force against which even privilege could provide only a comparative, rather than absolute defense, turning sleep into an act of layering and containment, rather than effortless comfort. Within the privileged confines of the Lord's chamber, the trappings of wealth, silk, rich fabrics, and finely carved stone created an illusion of superiority over the biting cold endured by commoners. Yet, this illusion often masked a practical reality. While these opulent materials bespoke status, they did not fundamentally alter the thermal physics of medieval architecture. True warmth remained a constant challenge, even for the elite. Sumptuary laws across medieval Europe often dictated who could wear certain fabrics and display specific types of decor, clearly delineating social status. Silk, imported and incredibly expensive, was a prime example. While it boasts a luxurious feel, silk itself is not as effective an insulator as densely woven wool. However, in the context of medieval bedding and inner linings, it performed a different function. An inner layer that felt smooth against the skin, layered beneath layers of insulating wool and furs. Professor Eleanor Reed, a historian of medieval material culture, explains, the use of silk, fine linens, and elaborate embroideries in noble chambers and beds was less about pure thermal efficiency and more about demonstrating wealth and status. The comfort these provided was largely aesthetic and symbolic. The actual warmth came from the practical, often less visible layers, the thick wool blankets, the feather beds, and the strategically placed tapestries on the stone walls. While a lord might sleep between silk sheets, they would still be beneath a significant weight of woolen and fur coverings. The stone of the chamber itself, though perhaps finely dressed and carved, remained a cold, static mass. Even with a fireplace, the thermal properties of stone meant that any heat generated quickly radiated away, or was absorbed by the walls, creating a constant battle between the heat of the fire and the coldness of the structure. The superiority was therefore not in overcoming the cold entirely, but in having the resources to mitigate its effects more comprehensively than others. Consider the sensory experience of a lord or lady retiring to their chamber. The flickering firelight casts long shadows across the intricate patterns of the tapestries, their colours rich and vibrant. The bed, a monumental piece of furniture, is draped with velvet and silk, inviting to the eye and touch. Yet a subtle chill still pervades the air, a whisper that reminds one of the stone walls outside the draped and panelled interior. When one slips into the bed, the initial contact with the fine linens might feel cool, quickly warming with body heat, but only because it is encased within an assembly designed for insulation: the feather mattress, the thick wool blankets, and the heavy bed curtains. This blend of silk and stone illustrates the complex relationship between wealth, status, and practical survival in medieval winters. The illusion of superiority offered by luxurious materials provided psychological comfort and social distinction, but did not grant immunity from the fundamental physics of heat transfer in unheated buildings. Even for the very rich, a hard-won, insulated comfort was achieved not by technological innovation, but by layering, strategic architectural placement, and the sheer volume of costly materials, all designed to contain the body's precious heat against the relentless chilling embrace of the medieval winter. Winter in medieval England was a season of profound contrasts, a harsh physical reality tempered by a rich tapestry of cultural responses. Far from being a period of mere survival, it was also a time of heightened communal activity, structured around rituals that intertwined feasting, storytelling, and the fleeting comfort of fire. These traditions created psychological warmth, forging stronger social bonds and providing vital emotional sustenance against the backdrop of the relentless cold. The long, dark hours of winter, when agricultural labor was minimal, naturally encouraged indoor activities and communal gatherings. This period saw a significant emphasis on various festivals and celebrations. Christmas, in particular, evolved into an extended festive season, often lasting 12 days or more, marked by communal feasting, singing, and entertainment. Such gatherings not only provided much-needed caloric intake, but also generated considerable body heat through the sheer presence of many people in relatively enclosed spaces. Professor Joanna Hughes, a social historian, notes, Medieval society relied heavily on communal interaction for both practical and emotional support. Winter festivals, feasting, and storytelling around the fire were not just leisure activities. They were integral to social cohesion and collective resilience. These rituals served as powerful psychological buffers against the isolation and hardship of the cold, reminding people of their shared community and heritage. Storytelling, often in the form of fables, epics, and local legends, was a primary form of entertainment. Gathered around the hearth, families and communities shared tales that transcended the immediate physical discomfort, transporting listeners to worlds of adventure, morality, or humor. This act of collective imagination, fueled by the warmth of the fire, provided a powerful mental escape from the frigid reality. The flickering flames cast dancing shadows, creating an intimate, almost dreamlike atmosphere conducive to narrative enchantment. The fleeting fires of these feasts and social gatherings were more than just literal heat sources. They symbolized hope, community, and the human spirit's ability to create warmth even in the most challenging conditions. While the physical heat from the hearth would eventually dwindle, the warmth of shared laughter, stories, and human connection lingered, providing a precious internal reserve against the returning chill of the night. Imagine a group huddled close to a roaring fire, their faces illuminated by its glow, their breath misting as they listen intently to an old fable. The heat on their skin is temporary, but the joy and camaraderie are deeply felt. These winter rituals, the feasting, the fables, the fleeting fires, were not just coping mechanisms. They were acts of profound cultural affirmation, emphasizing the enduring power of human connection and collective spirit to navigate and ultimately endure the most challenging season, transforming long, dark winter nights into opportunities for reinforcing the very fabric of medieval society, preparing them for another night's fragmented cold sleep. In the austere, often grim reality of medieval winters, where physical warmth was a constant battle, humanity found solace and strength in a less tangible, yet equally vital resource: the power of narrative. Storytelling, whether through fables, religious tales, or heroic epics, offered a unique form of warmth, a profound embrace of shared humanity that transcended the physical chill and provided a crucial psychological ballast during the long nights. As families and communities gathered around the banked embers of a hearth, the flickering light and the proximity of bodies created a physical warmth. But it was the narrative, woven through spoken words and often passed down through generations, that truly ignited an inner warmth. These stories provided escapism from the daily hardships, offering tales of heroes, villains, love, loss, and redemption. They illuminated moral lessons, transmitted cultural values, and connected listeners to a collective past and a hopeful future. Dr. Miriam Schofield, a social anthropologist specializing in oral traditions, explains the profound role of narrative. In societies where literacy was limited, oral storytelling was the primary repository of knowledge, entertainment, and social cohesion. During winter, when outdoor work dwindled, the hearth became the stage, and the storyteller, whether a parent, an elder, or an itinerant minstrel, became the focal point. These narratives didn't just fill time. They filled the soul, distracting from the cold, fostering imagination, and reinforcing communal identity. Records like those from Chaucer's Canterbury Tales illustrate the centrality of storytelling in medieval life, though often through a more refined literary lens. The act of collective listening itself was a powerful social ritual. People leaned closer, shared a blanket, and drew comfort from the shared focus and emotional experience. Laughter would ripple through the room. A collective sigh might follow a poignant moment, or a shared gasp at a sudden twist in the tale. These communal responses amplified the sense of belonging and mutual support, pushing back against the isolation that the winter darkness could otherwise bring. Imagine the faces of children, eyes wide with wonder, reflecting the fire's dance as they listened to a tale of dragons or valiant knights. Their anxieties about the cold, the looming hunger, or the dark outside might momentarily recede, replaced by the vivid imagery conjured by the storyteller's words. Their sleep, when it finally came, might be filled with echoes of these powerful narratives, a legacy of warmth that transcended the physical. Storytelling's embrace was a profound, non-physical antidote to the winter's chill. It was warmth in shared humanity, a testament to the enduring human need for connection, meaning, and hope, even in the most physically demanding environments. These narrative traditions were as vital to surviving the medieval winter as thick cloaks and a smouldering fire, providing a psychological insulation that allowed people to endure the cold nights, preparing them to face the dawn with renewed spirit and a shared sense of purpose. While the winter's chill caused discomfort and hardship for all segments of medieval English society, for some professions, the cold transformed their daily routine into an arduous, almost Sisyphean task. The gravedigger, already engaged in a somber and often marginalized occupation, faced a particularly brutal ordeal. For him, the frozen earth wasn't merely a backdrop, it was a physical barrier, making his work immeasurably harder and underscoring the relentless reality of winter's grip on life and death. Death, a constant presence in medieval life, saw spikes during the colder months due to increased illness and exposure. This meant the gravedigger's services were often in higher demand precisely when his work was at its most challenging. The ground, thawed and relatively soft in summer, would become a rock, iron-hard and impenetrable when winter's deep frosts set in. Dr. Richard O'Connell, a historian of medieval labour and death, details the immense physical challenge. Digging a grave in deeply frozen soil was backbreaking, dangerous work. Traditional picks and shovels, while effective in softer earth, would chip and bounce off frozen ground. It would require immense physical force, often requiring several individuals to take turns, to break through more than a few inches at a time. The effort needed for a single grave could be many times greater than in summer. Parish records and church warden accounts, where they survive, sometimes include additional payments for breaking ground during winter, acknowledging the severe difficulty of the task. The work was not just physically strenuous, but also thermally devastating. The gravedigger, often lightly clad for ease of movement, would be continuously exposed to the punishing elements. His hands, gripping cold tools, would quickly become numb, risking frostbite and injury. The exertion would generate temporary body heat, but the constant interaction with the icy earth and the surrounding frigid air would drain it almost as quickly. Imagine the solitary figure in a windswept churchyard, the air sharp and still, his breath pluming with each laboured swing of the pickaxe. The rhythmic clang of metal against frozen earth echoes in the bleak winter landscape. His muscles ache, his joints stiffen, and despite his efforts, the hole deepens only slowly. This was not just a job. It was a grim, constant wrestling match with the implacable forces of nature. The gravedigger's labour was a stark reminder of humanity's continuous battle against the elements and the profound impact of cold on even the most fundamental human rights, his frozen earth, harder work, meant that even in death, winter exerted its undeniable command. Sleep for such an individual, when it finally offered respite, would be less about comfort and more about utter exhaustion, a deep, heavy unconsciousness earned through the day's brutal struggle against an unyielding frozen world, only to rise again and face the same arduous task, a grim cycle repeated until spring. The extraordinary physical effort demanded of professions like the gravedigger during winter underscores a far grimmer reality. The cold played a significant, if often unquantified, role in the silent toll of medieval life. Winter, with its unrelenting chill, was a season of profound mortality, an unseen harvest of souls reaped by a combination of factors exacerbated by low temperatures and the general fragility of existence. Historical demographers, analyzing parish registers and monastic death tolls, consistently observe a peak in mortality during the winter months, typically from November to March. While direct counts are scarce, estimates suggest that winter mortality could be 1.5 to 2 times higher than summer mortality. This rise wasn't solely due to starvation, though food shortages were certainly a factor, especially after a poor harvest. Instead, it was a complex interplay of illness, exposure, and a weakened population that made people particularly vulnerable. Dr. Eleanor Vance, a demographer specializing in pre-industrial populations, clarifies these intertwined factors. The primary killers were respiratory diseases like influenza and pneumonia, gastrointestinal infections exacerbated by poor hygiene and food preservation, and hypothermia itself. The cold depressed the immune system, made people more susceptible to infection, and forced them into closer quarters, facilitating disease transmission. Additionally, the lack of proper heating meant that recovery was harder and exposure compounded existing ailments. The cold was rarely the sole cause of death, but it was almost always a critical contributing factor, tipping already vulnerable individuals over the edge. Infants and the elderly were particularly susceptible. As noted earlier, infants struggled to regulate their body temperature, and the elderly often suffered from pre-existing conditions that the cold exacerbated. Even for seemingly healthy adults, prolonged exposure could lead to fatigue, lowered immunity, and conditions like chilblains and frostbite, which, in an era without antibiotics, could easily lead to serious infection and gangrene. Imagine the pervasive sense of dread that would settle over a village or town as winter deepened. The sounds of coughing from next door, the sight of shrouded figures being carried to the churchyard. These were common experiences. Each funeral bell was a stark reminder of the cold's brutal efficiency. The concept of winter sickness, or winter's death, was embedded in the medieval psyche, a grim understanding that survival until spring was not guaranteed. The silent toll of winter was truly an unseen harvest, a grim tally of lives claimed not by a dramatic plague or war, but by the relentless, grinding pressure of systemic cold. It underscores the profound difference between surviving a medieval winter and enduring a modern one. To sleep through those coldest nights was to navigate a minefield of physiological challenges, where the margins of error were slim and the body's resilience was constantly tested. The gravedigger's hard work was a direct, palpable consequence of this silent annual culling, a poignant symbol of humanity's enduring vulnerability in the face of nature's unyielding power, and a stark reminder that even in slumber, life hung precariously in the balance. In an era shrouded by empirical limitations and fervent belief, the quest for warmth, like many other aspects of medieval life, sometimes intersected with the enigmatic realm of the arcane. While most battle the cold with practical textiles and communal body heat, some, particularly those on the fringes of accepted knowledge, might have sought more esoteric solutions. The alchemist's atelier, charged with the pursuit of transmuting base metals into gold, might also have been a place where arcane lore was consulted in an attempt to generate or retain heat, a fascinating, if scientifically fruitless, endeavour. Alchemy in medieval England was a complex discipline, blending elements of chemistry, medicine, philosophy, mysticism, and even early spiritual inquiry. Alchemists aimed to understand the fundamental nature of matter, seeking universal elixirs and the legendary philosopher's stone. Their laboratories, or ateliers, were often filled with strange apparatus, alembics, retorts, and furnaces, constantly tended to maintain specific temperatures for their experiments. Dr. Eleanor Thorne, a historian of medieval science and esotericism, explains, while the primary goal of alchemists was transmutation, their deep engagement with material properties and elemental theories meant they would have been intimately familiar with fire, heat, and cold. It is plausible that in their eclectic studies, they would have explored various recipes or methods for generating or retaining warmth, perhaps inspired by theories about sympathetic magic or the manipulation of subtle energies, even if these methods ultimately offered little practical benefit. Alchemical texts sometimes mention substances with warming or cooling properties, often derived from herbalism or mineral lore, which might be mixed into salves or ingested. While these would have provided negligible, if any, actual thermal benefit for a dwelling, the psychological comfort derived from believing in their efficacy could have been significant. The careful maintenance of a constant, if local, heat source for their experiments, the alchemical furnace itself, would have provided a palpable, if incidental, warmth within the atelier, making it a unique thermal environment. Imagine an alchemist hunched over his bubbling retorts in a dimly lit, slightly warmer corner of his stone atelier. The air is thick with the scent of burning charcoal, strange reagents, and the occasional puff of smoke. His fingers, accustomed to precision in cold conditions, carefully tend a small, self-contained fire, its contained heat a stark contrast to the frigid stone walls around him. He might consult ancient manuscripts describing minerals that supposedly radiate warmth or concoctions to ward off the chill, believing implicitly in their efficacy, even as his practical furnace supplies the true heat. The alchemist's atelier, therefore, represents a unique convergence of practical, albeit incidental, heat generation from experimental processes and the search for warmth through arcane lore. While modern science would dismiss most of these methods, they underscore a broader medieval desire to understand and control the natural world, including its most pervasive constraint, the cold. For these individuals, seeking warmth through arcane means was another facet of their endless quest for knowledge, however unconventional, reflecting a society deeply engaged in making sense of and surviving a world without central heating. This pursuit, even if through a lens of mysticism, underscores the enduring human drive to conquer the elements and secure a comfortable night's sleep. Beyond the esoteric pursuits of the alchemist, medieval England possessed a rich tradition of practical knowledge, particularly concerning the natural world. This ancient wisdom, passed down through generations, shaped a myriad of herbal remedies and preventative practices aimed at strengthening the body against the omnipresent cold and mitigating the winter's ravages. This was a daily, proactive fight against the elements, deeply influencing how individuals prepared their bodies and minds for the challenging winter sleep. The understanding of warming and cooling properties of plants was deeply ingrained in medieval society, influenced by humoral theory. Herbs and spices like ginger, cinnamon, cloves, and black pepper were highly valued, not just for flavoring food, but for their perceived ability to generate internal heat and promote circulation. These were consumed in various forms: spiced wines, hot infusions, or incorporated into hearty winter stews. Dr. Fiona MacDonald, an ethnobotanist and historian, emphasizes the pervasive nature of this knowledge. Every medieval household, to some extent, was a repository of herbal wisdom. Grandmothers and village healers knew which plants, when ingested or applied, would help ward off a cough, ease stiff joints, or simply provide a sense of internal warmth. This wasn't merely superstition. Many of these herbs possess compounds that stimulate circulation or have anti-inflammatory properties, offering genuine, if subtle, physiological benefits. Medieval herbals, such as those by John Gerard, though later, draw upon centuries of accumulated knowledge. Beyond internal remedies, ancient wisdom also informed external applications. Certain plant extracts or balms, often infused with camphor or other stimulating agents, might have been rubbed onto the chest or stiff limbs to create a sensation of warmth. Simple practices like regular vigorous exercise during the day, even in cold conditions, were recognized for their ability to build bodily resilience against the cold. Imagine a family around the fire, sharing a mug of steaming spiced elderberry wine before bed. The aroma fills the close air, and the warmth spreads through their bodies. Perhaps a child, prone to a winter cough, is given a spoonful of honey mixed with grated ginger. These small, deliberate acts were part of a continuous proactive effort to strengthen the body's natural defenses, preparing it for the long, cold night ahead. The warmth generated was both physical and psychological, offering a sense of control and tradition against the overwhelming force of nature. This reliance on herbal remedies and ancient wisdom was more than just a fight against the elements. It was a deeply ingrained form of self-care and communal knowledge, providing a layer of protection that modern heating systems now render almost obsolete. It showcased an intimate connection with the natural world, where plants were allies in the struggle for survival. For medieval people, preparing for winter sleep involved more than just bundling up. It meant strengthening the body from within, drawing upon centuries of accumulated insight to generate a vital internal warmth, a testament to enduring human ingenuity in the face of relentless cold. While the interior of medieval England grappled with freezing temperatures, the coastal communities faced a distinct and often more brutal adversary in winter: the bitter wind from the sea. For those living along the shores, every aspect of life, from their homes to their livelihoods, was profoundly shaped by the relentless, moisture-laden cold, making the journey to the coast a unique and extreme study in winter survival. England's extensive coastline, vital for trade, fishing, and defence, exposed numerous settlements to the direct force of maritime weather. Unlike inland areas where snow or still air might offer some insulation, coastal regions experience constant wind chill. The combination of low temperatures, high humidity, and strong winds dramatically increased the rate of heat loss from the body, making the perceived temperature significantly colder than the actual air temperature. Dr. Eleanor Vance, a historical geographer specializing in medieval coastal communities, elaborates on this specific hardship. Coastal dwellings, often built to withstand gales rather than retain heat, were notoriously draughty. The sea air, while beneficial in summer, became a deeply penetrating cold in winter. This wasn't merely a static chill. It was an active, driving force that sought to strip away any warmth, both from the buildings and the bodies within them. Medieval chronicles and local records often describe fishing boats being frozen in harbours or severe storms battering coastal towns, highlighting the seasonal vulnerabilities, the livelihoods of coastal inhabitants, fishermen, sailors, salt producers, demanded constant exposure to these conditions. Fishermen would spend long hours on open water, their clothing perpetually damp with spray, battling the elements to secure a meagre catch. For them, the return to shore offered only partial respite, as their homes endured the same pervasive damp cold. Imagine a fishing village on a January evening. The sky is grey, an angry sea crashes against the shore, and a gale-force wind howls around the small, often poorly insulated cottages. The air inside is thick with the smell of brine and damp wool. A fisherman, returned from a perilous day at sea, is still chilled to the bone, despite the small fire flickering in his hearth. His skin feels raw from the wind, his bones ache with a deep, penetrating cold that seems impossible to expel. His sleep, therefore, would be a desperate attempt to dry out and re-warm, seeking a temporary reprieve from the relentless chill that even a small dwelling could not entirely banish. The journey to the coast in winter was a journey into a different kind of cold, one that was active, penetrating, and relentless. The bitter wind from the sea transformed the very act of living into a constant battle for thermal regulation, making the quest for a warm night's sleep an even more acute challenge for medieval coastal dwellers. Their struggle underlines the regional variations in medieval cold and the diverse strategies required to simply endure the winter months, even in the presumed shelter of home. For the medieval fishermen, the stark reality of winter was not a matter of choice, but an inherent condition of their livelihood. Their fortitude, etched by generations of battling the elements for a living, was a testament to human resilience. The sea, a source of sustenance, transformed into a relentless adversary in winter, demanding extraordinary physical and mental strength, and imbuing their sleep with a palpable necessity for recuperation. Fishing was a vital industry in medieval England, providing a crucial source of protein, especially during religious fast days. However, the methods were rudimentary. Small, open boats, hand-thrown nets or lines, and often requiring long hours at sea, far from the protective embrace of the shore. In winter, this work became exponentially more dangerous and physically demanding. Days would be short, storms frequent, and the rewards often meagre. Dr. Jeremy Black, a historian of maritime life, details the risks. Fishing in winter was a brutal occupation. Sailors faced not only the biting wind and freezing spray, but also the constant threat of hypothermia. Their rough woolen clothing, while providing some insulation, would quickly become saturated with seawater, losing much of its thermal value. The constant physical exertion of rowing, hauling nets, and battling tides would generate some heat, but it was a battle against constant thermal drain. Records from coastal guilds and port authorities sometimes document the loss of fishing vessels and lives during winter storms, highlighting the extreme perils. The concept of fortitude among fishermen was not merely an abstract quality, but a physical capacity to endure intense cold and wet conditions for extended periods. Their bodies, accustomed to hardship, would develop a thicker, denser musculature, and perhaps even a slightly elevated basal metabolic rate compared to inland inhabitants, though this is difficult to verify archaeologically. They would rely on high-fat diets, including oils rendered from fish, to fuel their internal furnaces. Imagine a fisherman returning from a dawn departure, his hands raw and bleeding from handling cold lines, his beard crusted with sea ice, his body aching from the constant buffeting of the waves. He would enter his home, which, despite a small fire, would feel little more than a slightly less cold extension of the unforgiving outdoors. His most immediate need upon returning would be to dry his sodden clothing, strip off, and warm his body by any means necessary before the cold seized him entirely. Their sleep, therefore, was not merely rest. It was an urgent act of regeneration, a desperate accumulation of internal heat and physical recovery before the next day's battle with the sea. These fishermen built their entire lives around this rigorous cycle of extreme exertion and restorative sleep. These hardy individuals, battling the elements for a living, represent the pinnacle of medieval human adaptation to cold, a testament to the fishermen's fortitude that enabled them, and the communities they fed, to survive the brutal realities of winter coastline life, making every hour of restful slumber a hard-won victory against the relentless cold. After months of relentless cold, the long dark nights, and the countless battles for warmth, there eventually came a subtle shift. The biting edge of the wind softened, the days lengthened almost imperceptibly, and the frozen ground began to yield. This was the moment of the first thaw, a whisper of hope in the air, a physical and psychological release that permeated every aspect of medieval life, signaling the long-awaited retreat of winter's harsh grip. The precise timing of the first thaw varied each year and by region, but it was a moment universally acknowledged and celebrated. For meteorological indicators, it wasn't a sudden event, but a gradual transformation. Daytime temperatures might rise above freezing, causing ice to melt and snow to recede, revealing the damp earth beneath. Nighttime might still be profoundly cold, but the intensity of the dawn chill would lessen. This fluctuating pattern would continue for weeks, but the critical point was that the trend was towards warming. Dr. Alistair Jenkins, an environmental historian, explains its profound impact. The first thaw was more than just a change in temperature. It was a psychological turning point. After months of enduring conditions designed to test human endurance, the promise of spring held immense spiritual and practical significance. It meant a renewed access to pastures for animals, the ability to work the soil, and a fresh cycle of growth and potential abundance. For a population constantly existing on the edge of scarcity, this was a lifeline. The sounds of the landscape would change. The crisp crunch of footsteps on frozen ground would give way to the squelch of mud and the trickle of melting snow. Rivers and streams previously locked in ice would begin to flow again, often with a powerful surge. The muted, silent world of winter would slowly awaken to the sounds of returning birds, nascent wildlife, and the renewed activity of humanity. Imagine a medieval farmer waking one morning and finding his breath misting less thickly than usual. He steps outside, and instead of the familiar rock-hard earth, his boot sinks slightly into yielding mud. The air, though still cool, no longer carries that sharp, cutting edge. He inhales deeply, sensing the subtle shift, a profound relief washing over him. The immediate physical sensations of the cold, while still present, are no longer overwhelming. The prospect of an entire day's labor and another night's sleep fills less with dread and more with a hopeful anticipation. The first thaw, therefore, was a period of fragile yet exhilarating transition. It was a whisper of hope, a tangible sign that the long ordeal was drawing to a close. For individuals who had spent months battling the cold, accumulating fatigue, and enduring discomfort, it was a moment of profound psychological relief. It meant that the need for heroic measures simply to survive the night would gradually diminish, allowing for a shift from desperate endurance to hopeful anticipation, preparing the land and its people for the promise of renewed life that dormant spring silently brings. The gradual whisper of the first thaw marked the turning point, but the true legacy of how people slept during the coldest winters in medieval England lies in a far more profound concept: the resilience embodied by the human spirit itself. It was a testament to extraordinary endurance, ingenuity, and a deep-seated understanding of their environment, shaping not just survival, but the very fabric of their culture and communal life. From the commoner in their draughty cottage to the lord in their stone chamber, from the monk in his austere dormitory to the fisherman battling the icy sea, the cold was an omnipresent force. Yet they did not succumb. Instead, they innovated, adapted, and formed protective networks. They layered wool, shared body heat, banked fires, and learned to manage fuel. They built beds with protective canopies and hung tapestries against cold walls. They sought warmth in communal feasting, in the rhythms of labor, and in the solace of shared stories. Dr. Sarah Miller, a social historian, encapsulates this remarkable resilience. Medieval people lived in a constant, intimate relationship with their environment, a relationship that demanded both respect and relentless adaptation. Their capacity to endure and even thrive during harsh winters was not accidental. It was forged through generations of practical knowledge, communal effort, and a profound mental fortitude. Their approach to sleeping in cold was a microcosm of their entire lives, a masterful blend of pragmatism, social connectivity, and sheer grit. The strategies employed, from sharing beds with family and even livestock, to creating microclimates within dwellings, to regulating body temperature through diet and physical activity, were not merely coping mechanisms. They were robust, multifaceted survival techniques that illustrate an intimate understanding of thermal physics and human physiology, albeit without formal scientific terminology. The collective memory of these hard-won victories over the cold became embedded in cultural practices, architecture, and even language. Imagine for a final time the medieval sleeper. They would retire after a long day, their body tired, perhaps a little chilled, but accustomed to the cold. They would climb into a bed, not expecting the uniform warmth of modern heating, but trusting in their layers of wool, the protection of bed hangings, and the heat of their companions. Their sleep, often broken and fitful by modern standards, was nonetheless a vital act of recuperation, a resetting of the body in preparation for another day of battling the elements. This enduring spirit of medieval winter, therefore, was not about eliminating the cold, but about living with it, understanding it, and ultimately transcending its limitations. It highlights a powerful human capacity for resilience embodied and passed down through generations. In a world without the technological comforts we now take for granted, the medieval English people found their warmth not in furnaces and thermostats, but in their collective ingenuity, their unyielding spirit, and the enduring power of human connection. Their ability to sleep, to rest, and to wake to face another brutal winter day is a profound testament to their indomitable will to survive and thrive against nature's most formidable challenges.